There are moments in life when words fall short, when human language stumbles before the greatness of God. In those sacred moments, silence becomes our purest form of worship. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that overflows with faith. There is a profound mystery in silence, especially when it is joined with unwavering faith. It is in that silence where the soul communes most deeply with God. Words may sometimes build walls, but silence, true, believing silence, builds altars. In that stillness, the heart kneels even when the body stands. It is a sacred exchange where human striving ends and divine power begins. When we are silent before God, we are saying, "I trust you more than I trust my reasoning." The voice of faith does not always echo through words. Sometimes it whispers through peace. The world measures faith by expression, but heaven measures it by surrender. There is something deeply holy about a heart that can wait without anxiety, believe without proof, and love without demanding explanations. That heart speaks a language heaven understands perfectly, the language of silence filled with faith. David Yonggi Cho often spoke of the invisible connection between faith and the unseen realm. He taught that the spiritual world moves not by the volume of our prayers, but by the substance of our belief. When faith fills the silence, it becomes a creative force, shaping realities that have not yet appeared. In the stillness, God is working. In the quiet heart, miracles are being born. And that is why those who truly believe can afford to be still. They know the battle is already won. The world around us confuses noise with power. It celebrates the loud, the visible, the dramatic. But in the kingdom of God, the greatest strength is often hidden beneath calm surrender. A faith-filled silence is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of someone who has already heard the answer in their spirit. It is the silence of trust after the promise, of confidence after the word has been spoken. When you have truly heard God, there is nothing left to argue, nothing left to explain, only to believe. Look at the life of Jesus. When he was accused, mocked, and condemned, he could have spoken one word to summon angels. But he remained silent, not because he was powerless, but because his silence fulfilled prophecy and revealed perfect trust in the Father's plan. That silence changed the destiny of mankind. It was silence filled with faith, and through it, redemption flowed like a river. So many of us pray, yet never stop to listen. We speak to God, but we do not wait for him to speak back. We pour out words, but we rarely pause in stillness. Faith, however, is not only expressed in petitions, it is expressed in rest. It is the art of letting go of control, of ceasing from striving, and of allowing God to be God. The more mature our faith becomes, the quieter our souls grow. Silence filled with faith is not passive. It is an active resting in divine certainty. It is standing before impossibility and saying nothing, because your spirit already knows that God has spoken victory. It is like a seed buried in the soil, and nothing can be seen above the ground, but life is stirring underneath. The silence of the seed is not the silence of death, it is the silence of preparation. When faith fills your silence, something is growing in the unseen. There are times when words are too small for the vastness of what we believe. When Abraham looked at the stars, he did not argue or question. He simply believed. When Mary received the word of the angel, she did not demand proof. She kept those things and pondered them in her heart. Their silence was not the absence of thought, it was the fullness of faith. The holiest language is that which does not need translation, because it is spoken directly to the heart of God. Dr. Cho often described prayer not as a performance, but as an intimate dialogue between spirit and spirit. In that deep communion, words eventually become unnecessary. There is a point in prayer where the tongue grows still, but the heart continues speaking. There is a level of faith that no longer pleads, but simply knows. That knowing is silence in motion, the soundless rhythm of belief that cannot be shaken. When we learn to embrace this kind of silence, we begin to live differently. Anxiety loses its grip. Fear loses its voice. The storms may still rage around us, but within us there is a calm that cannot be disturbed. That calm is faith clothed in silence. It is the same calm that carried Daniel in the lion's den, the same peace that sustained Paul in prison, the same trust that kept Job worshiping even in his pain. Each of them, in their own way, spoke the holiest language, silence filled with faith. There is power in words, but there is greater power in what lies beyond them. The faith transforms silence into a living testimony. When you no longer need to explain your hope, defend your belief, or justify your patience, it means your trust has reached maturity. The truest faith does not shout, it radiates. It doesn't need an audience because heaven is already listening. When you walk through the valleys of uncertainty, it is easy to think that silence means abandonment. But faith-filled silence is never empty. It carries the weight of divine presence. God often hides in silence, not to distance himself, but to draw us deeper. When he seems quiet, he is often the closest. When he doesn't speak, he is teaching us to hear in new ways. Our generation has forgotten the sacredness of quiet trust. We rush to fill every gap with words, opinions, or explanations. But faith does not rush, it waits, it rests, it believes. It stands before the invisible and says, "It is done," even when there is no sign of fulfillment. That kind of faith is the highest form of worship. It is the language of heaven spoken through the heart of man. The holiest silence is not empty. It is filled with the echo of divine promises, the assurance of God's faithfulness, and the calm of a heart anchored in his will. When the believer stands still, when all striving stops and the heart simply trusts, that silence becomes a prayer that shakes heaven. It is a sanctuary where God dwells, a moment when eternity touches time and the unseen becomes real. Those who master this silence walk in peace. They do not need to prove their faith because their lives become proof enough. Their stillness is not weakness but wisdom, for they have learned that the loudest voice in the universe is the quiet whisper of a faithful heart. There is a sacred beauty that lives within the silence of faith, a stillness so deep that it transcends language itself. It is not the silence of indifference or emptiness, but the silence of a soul resting completely in God. When a person reaches that place where fear has no voice and doubt has no echo, then silence becomes holy. It becomes the sanctuary where heaven meets the heart. In that silence, God does not just listen, he obedes. The power of this silence is beyond what human understanding can measure. It is the language of trust that cannot be misinterpreted, the quiet surrender that invites divine intervention. The saints and prophets who walked closest with God all understood it. They did not always speak with many words, yet their faith spoke volumes. There are moments when the most powerful prayer is not the one uttered with passion, but the one held in quiet confidence. That still, wordless assurance moves mountains because it is born not from human reasoning, but from divine certainty. Faith-filled silence is not inactivity, it is alignment. It is the moment when the soul stands in perfect harmony with the will of God. It does not argue with his timing. It does not question his methods, and it does not demand signs, it simply believes. This kind of silence carries the fragrance of peace, the weight of maturity, and the strength of one who has already seen the promise in the Spirit before it manifests in the flesh. It is the language of those who know that God's word, once spoken, cannot return void. In our noisy world, people often mistake talking for believing. They think the louder the prayer, the stronger the faith. But true faith does not need to shout to be heard. God hears the silent heartbeat of trust more clearly than the loudest declarations of doubt. When your faith has matured, you do not need to explain your hope or convince others of your belief. You simply live it. Every breath becomes a testimony, every moment of stillness a declaration that you have placed everything in the hands of the one who never fails. David Yonggi Cho once said that faith is the bridge between the invisible and the visible. That bridge is not built by words alone, but by the still confidence that refuses to collapse under pressure. When a person walks that bridge in silence, they are not empty, they are full. Full of assurance, full of peace, full of the quiet strength that comes from knowing that God has already made a way. The holiest language is not formed by the tongue, but by the heart that listens, even when heaven seems silent. Think of Elijah on the mountain. He expected God to speak through the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. But the voice of the Lord came in a gentle whisper. It was a quiet sound, almost nothing at all, yet it carried all the power of heaven. The lesson was clear. The presence of God does not always come through dramatic signs or thunderous speech. It often comes through quiet faith. The holiest encounters are the ones that happen in silence, where only the Spirit can hear what the ear cannot. There is a divine rhythm in the silence of faith. It is the pause between our prayer and God's answer, the stillness before the dawn of a miracle. When we learn to honor that pause, we enter the realm of spiritual maturity. We stop striving, stop forcing, and start trusting. Silence is not the absence of movement. It is the preparation for breakthrough. The world may see nothing happening, but heaven sees everything aligning. The quiet heart is never idle. It is waiting with purpose. When Jesus stood before his accusers, he said almost nothing. His silence was not weakness, it was wisdom. His faith did not need to defend itself, for truth stands firm without argument. That silence carried the power to redeem all humanity. It was filled with obedience, confidence, and love beyond comprehension. That moment reminds us that silence in the hands of the faithful is mightier than the noise of the world. It is in that same spirit that we too can face trials without panic and endure storms without fear. Silence filled with faith becomes a fortress. When everything around you shakes, your silence declares, "I will not be moved." It is the mark of someone who has ceased to wrestle with uncertainty and has chosen to rest in divine sovereignty. The enemy cannot interpret silence. It confuses him. He thrives on fear, complaint, and doubt, but he has no weapon against calm assurance. The quiet believer becomes untouchable, for their silence is a shield woven from trust in God's unchanging promise. There is a kind of music in faith-filled silence, a melody that only heaven can hear. It is the sound of surrender, the harmony of stillness and belief. It is what happens when the soul sings without sound, when the spirit prays without words. In that moment, the entire being of a person becomes an offering to God. The noise of the world fades, and all that remains is communion, pure and unbroken. Faith-filled silence transforms how we see everything. Suddenly, delays no longer feel like denials. The waiting becomes sacred. Pain becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. The absence of answers becomes an opportunity to deepen trust. You begin to realize that silence is not a gap between prayers. It is a part of the prayer itself. It is the interval in which faith grows roots. This holy silence is not reserved for saints or prophets alone. It is the inheritance of every believer who dares to trust without explanation. When we stop depending on what we can see, we begin to hear what can only be perceived by faith. In the quiet, God shapes our character. He teaches us patience, endurance, and gratitude. The silence that once felt heavy becomes light with meaning. The waiting that once felt endless becomes precious because we realize that God is preparing something far greater than we imagined. The holiest silence is not passive, nor is it empty. It is filled with divine dialogue. Every heartbeat becomes a word, every breath a prayer, every tear an offering. In that state, faith no longer needs sound to express itself. It becomes the air we breathe. The believer who walks in such silence carries peace into every storm, light into every shadow, and confidence into every uncertainty. The deeper your faith, the quieter your soul becomes. You stop defending, stop demanding, stop fearing. You begin to rest in the truth that God is faithful even when you cannot see how. The storms lose their power because your heart is anchored in the unseen. And in that quiet place, miracles are conceived, not through noise, but through the holy silence that says, God is enough. There comes a moment in every believer's journey when words no longer suffice, when prayers turn into stillness, and the heart finds its truest expression in silence. This silence, when filled with faith, becomes more powerful than any proclamation. It is the moment when you stop explaining your faith and start embodying it. The air around you changes, the heaviness of striving lifts, and all that remains is quiet confidence that God is in control. The beauty of faith-filled silence is that it teaches you to listen, not just to the voice of God, but to the rhythm of His will. You begin to notice how His timing unfolds with perfect wisdom. You see that every delay was an act of protection, every silence an invitation to go deeper. The soul that once demanded answers now simply rests in the knowing that the one who holds the universe also holds your future. Such silence is not lifeless. It pulses with divine activity. In that stillness, faith matures. It stops being something you talk about and becomes something you live. You no longer need to convince yourself that God will provide. You simply wait with peace. You no longer fear what tomorrow brings, because you've learned that the same God who was faithful yesterday remains faithful today. This silence is a declaration without words. It says, I believe even when I don't see. It says, I trust even when I don't understand. It says, I rest because I know who holds me. When your silence is filled with faith, even your quiet presence can shift an atmosphere. The peace within you speaks louder than 1,000 sermons. Others may ask how you can remain calm amid uncertainty, and your answer is simply because your heart has learned the language of heaven, the language that doesn't depend on evidence or emotion, but on unwavering trust. Such silence carries a rare strength. It does not beg or bargain, it simply believes. It does not waver when the world trembles, because it is anchored in something eternal. In that sacred stillness, you begin to sense the movement of God more clearly than ever before. Every unanswered question becomes an altar of trust. Every moment of quiet becomes a step closer to divine revelation. Faith-filled silence is not an absence of prayer. It is prayer perfected. It is the heart resting in full surrender, knowing that God's whisper is louder than any storm, and His stillness more powerful than any sound on earth. So let us remember this truth with every breath we take. The holiest language is not found in eloquence, emotion, or endless words, but in the sacred silence that beats with faith. When all the noise fades and all striving ceases, it is in that quiet space that God's voice becomes clear. Faith-filled silence is not emptiness, it is divine fullness, a place where fear dissolves, hope rises, and the soul learns to trust without proof. May we dare to enter that silence, not as those who are uncertain, but as those who know that even when heaven seems still, God is working. For in the silence of faith, mountains move, hearts heal, and miracles are born.